What's up everybody, welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony, let's jump in. Okay, happy Monday everybody. I hope you're all having a productive day and a happy start to the week. Today we have a special video, another deep dive into yet another aspect of the Evergrande Housing Crisis and China's real estate market. We've been following the Evergrande crisis for some months now. Increasing numbers of property developers are in trouble, and the real estate market, representing over 80% of urban household wealth, is facing strong downward pressure, to put it mildly. So far, modest regulatory easing has done little to arrest the slowdown in the sector. Since the Central Economic Work Conference late last year, which we covered thoroughly at the time on China Update, the government has been pushing for greater support in subsidized rental housing, also to offset the downturn in commercial housing and pursue another major policy objective, common prosperity. This is because subsidized rental housing would be built for lower income people. The efforts are already underway. According to state-run CCTV, 1.9 million units of subsidized rental housing are to be built in 40 cities this year in 2022, more than double the just shy of 1 million units of 2021. Financial analysts believe that this number could be accurate. I and others are deeply skeptical, however, about whether subsidized rental housing could have anything but a modest mitigating effect on the economic fallout and resulting slowdown from the developer deleveraging campaign and the housing crisis, which we have seen unfold over the last several months. There are also questions like, how would this be paid for, especially with land sales down? However, we are seeing a lot of language surrounding rental housing. The government officials continue to hold this up as a silver bullet to fix many of the issues we're seeing in the housing sector and the crisis. So we should take time to explore this policy objective, and that is what we're going to do today. Building subsidized housing has been adopted in the past in the People's Republic of China to stabilize the real estate market, so this is not a new idea. For example, the State Council ordered more construction as early as 2011. The nature of subsidized housing has gone through transformations though. During the 12th five-year plan period, this is 2011 through to 2015, the focus shifted from the construction of affordable housing and price-capped housing to public rental housing with ownership held by the government. During the 13th five-year plan period, which ended in 2020, the focus moved to the renovation of old towns and shanty areas. Indeed, that shanty towns renovation drive is one of the factors that stabilized the housing market the last time there was a serious slowdown, back in 2015. It signaled to investors and builders that Beijing wanted the housing market to continue growing, and so investors and buyers were happy to pour back in. Moral hazard continued, and the housing sector chugged on for a few more years up until the most recent crisis. So, to many officials, that policy seemed successful, so perhaps it will work again. In mid-2021, the State Council issued a document called Opinions on Accelerating the Development of Subsidized Rental Housing, which became the first high-level design document for the development of subsidized rental housing that they are proposing now. We remember back in August of last year, we discussed the speech by Wang Menghui, Minister of Housing and Urban Rural Development. At the time, he said that Beijing would prioritize the development of subsidized rental housing to, quote, meet the housing needs of all people, end quote. An analyst following developments in the space recently observed that at present various parties, this is local and central government actors as well as investors and developers, both private and state-owned, have different opinions on the number of subsidized rental housing units to be built during the 14th five-year plan period, which ends in 2025. Now, we're going to touch on these numbers later in the video. What we do know is units are not just going to be built in backwaters. According to Caixin, Shanghai proposes to build more than 470,000 subsidized rental housing units during the 14th five-year plan period, accounting for 45% of total additional housing supply in the city. Though it should be noted, most of these units are far from the city center and very Spartan in their design. A key question with all this, of course, is how is this paid for? If subsidized housing is paid for by the liquidation of state assets, and then millions of these units are handed over to low-income households, then if managed well, it would represent a healthy rebalancing of the economy. It wouldn't fix all the problems, but it would be a rebalancing. However, if they're paid for through debt instruments or even tax on businesses and wealthy households, while this achieves some modest reduction of wealth disparities within the household sector, there is no rebalancing between the state and households generally. And if it is achieved through debt instruments, then it certainly does not help with the underlying debt issue within the economy, which is also increasingly acute. Analysts with Caixin observed that in the past, the funding program was, quote, basically solved through market-based operations as affordable housing and price-capped housing could be sold. The funds for the resettlement of shanty area residents mainly came through loans from the People's Bank of China through pledged supplementary lending, end quote, what one economist with Nomura called helicopter money. Now, with the new subsidized housing that is being currently built and being built over the next few years, financing is being achieved with subsidies from the government. These subsidies themselves are funded through taxes and fees such as value-added tax, real estate tax, and other taxes of the kind. And unsurprisingly, debt instruments are being used, with special bonds allocated to developers involved in subsidized housing. However, with the current crisis, investors have very little appetite for developer bonds, and analysts predict that local governments themselves will need to step in and issue special bonds in order to achieve the funding needed to build these units. Okay, so that is financing, but ultimately, how many units are we talking about here? Chief macro analyst at Huacheng Securities estimates that 7 million subsidized rental housing units could be built in large and medium-sized cities, Tier 1 through Tier 4, during the 2021 to 2025 period. The chief economist at Peng'an Securities puts that number at 7.8 million subsidized housing units. Some analysts are a little less than 7 million, some are a little more than 8 million, but you get the general idea. While this does sound like a lot of housing units over a 5-year period, in a nation of 1.4 billion, it remains very modest, especially considering that the larger property market represents somewhere from 25 to 30% of GDP as of the beginning of 2021. We also need to keep in mind that in some cases, new units will be converted from existing stock that hasn't sold. Indeed, state-owned enterprises may very well get these units cheap from liquidity crisis-hit private developers that are currently being forced through deleveraging. Also, many of the systemic issues which have shown their ugly head with this Evergrande crisis, moral hazard being the big one, are not solved with this rental housing push. The key question with all of this that we need to ask with this entire policy push is, will subsidized housing save the housing market and thus stabilize the wider Chinese economy like many officials have claimed? Writers with Chinese financial media outlet Caixin framed this question well in a recent article. Quote, to some extent, the rapid promotion of subsidized rental housing in 2022 can offset the downward pressure on investments in commercial housing. However, the question is, how well will it work? End quote. To answer this question, financial research firms have compared this current subsidized rental housing push during the 14th five-year plan of 2021 to 2025 with the so-called Shanty Area Redevelopment Campaign of the 13th five-year plan, which we discussed before. After all, the Shanty Area Redevelopment Campaign did stabilize the housing market during the last crisis around 2015-2016, like we mentioned before. The numbers, however, are not promising. Based on the numbers, most analysts have concluded that the projected construction volume of subsidized rental housing is less than 30% of the shanty area redevelopment projects, with investment intensity at about 1/3. This isn't good. Even if the levels were 100% of the shantytown redevelopment project levels, the current Evergrande housing crisis is larger in scale, more acute, and more system-wide than the last housing slowdown in 2015. Debt levels are higher now too, the population is older, and China is facing a much more difficult international environment, to put it mildly. Ultimately, while more subsidized housing will certainly improve the material well-being of many low-income Chinese families, which is indeed a great thing for those families, for the wider economy, my view can be summed up best, I think, with the words of one financial analyst, Yu Hairong, who last week expressed, quote, "The effect of subsidized rental housing in counterbalancing the real estate investment slum should not be overstated. This is because the slowing of real estate investment growth is irreversible." End quote. Hey guys, I'd love to hear what you thought about some of the updates we covered in today's episode, so throw your comments below. Always love hearing from you. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.